The earthquake hit southern Utah without warning. It was mid-September of 2022, and the heat had been relentless for weeks. Dry, stubborn, and sharp enough to split the soil. In the small town of Beacon Ridge, the fault line didn't just crack the earth, it folded it in on itself. Old brick buildings slumped like exhausted men, their frames groaning under decades of forgotten weight. Streets curled and buckled. Sidewalks split open like wounds. The air filled with a chalky haze, and for hours after, nothing moved. No birds, no sirens, just the occasional groan of something settling deeper into ruin. By the time the dust had cleared enough for search teams to enter, most of the survivors had already been pulled from visible wreckage. The news crews moved on to bigger stories, but the town remained, a skeleton of itself, barely breathing. On the third day, David arrived. He was a volunteer from St. George, a town a few hours southwest, where the damage had been felt, but not seen. He brought little: a flashlight, a respirator, work gloves, and a small thermos tucked inside an old hiking bag. His boots were worn and his eyes sunburnt. He didn't wear a uniform, didn't report to anyone. He had come because he couldn't stay away. He moved alone through the outskirts of the collapse zone, away from the generators and chatter of the main search teams. The noise of machines made it hard to hear. David wasn't looking for anyone in particular. He was listening for anything that hadn't yet given up. The air was dense with the scent of gypsum and heat. Each step stirred powdered stone that clung to his skin like memory. Past a collapsed laundromat, past a silent cafe with chairs still bolted to its outdoor patio. He came to what had once been an auto repair shop. The roof had folded inward like a cardboard box. The support beams jutted out at wild angles. Everything was gray, quiet, still. And then he heard it. Not a voice, not a scream. Something smaller, a thin, reedy sound that might have been the wind. Except it repeated. High-pitched, fragile, wounded. A whimper threaded so delicately into the air that it almost dissolved before reaching his ears. David froze, turned off the flashlight, stood absolutely still. There it was again, faint but undeniably alive. It came from deep beneath the twisted remains of the shop. He didn't call for backup, didn't radio anyone. Instead, he knelt and began moving debris with bare hands. First the lighter pieces, splintered wood, metal sheeting, broken plastic crates. Then the heavier ones, bricks and fragments of cinder blocks that scraped his knuckles raw. Dust choked the air. His mask grew damp with breath. He coughed, spat, and kept digging. There was no sense of time, only rhythm. Lift, pull, pause, listen. Every few minutes, he stopped to check if the sound was still there. It was. Not constant, but insistent. A life refusing to vanish. After an hour, sweat traced lines through the dust on his face. His shirt clung to his spine. A rusted beam blocked the way, pinning a large slab of concrete at an angle. David tested its weight. Too heavy to move alone, but if he shifted the right pieces, maybe he could reach under it. He kept at it, inch by inch, clearing a crawl space wide enough to press his arm through. He slid his hand into the gap. Nothing. Then something brushed against his fingers, warm, damp, trembling. He jerked back, startled, then forced himself to move slower, more carefully. He widened the hole. The sound came again, louder now. Not a bark, not a growl, a breath. Shallow and sharp, like it hurt to exist. And then, through the dim crack between metal and stone, he saw eyes. Deep brown, muddied with fear and grit, but open. A dog. Young, maybe. Muzzle streaked with ash. One ear torn. His body was wedged tightly between a fallen workbench and the concrete slab, so still he might have been mistaken for dead. But his chest rose, barely. David reached in again, palm open, not to grab, but to offer. The dog didn't move, but his eyes never left him. In that moment, beneath the ruins of Beacon Ridge, surrounded by silence so complete it rang, David knew he couldn't walk away. He didn't know how long it would take. Didn't care. The dog was breathing. That was enough. And so, while the sun dropped low behind the ridgeline, casting long golden shadows across the rubble, he kept digging. Alone. Unseen. Listening to the breath of something that hadn't given up yet. The collapsed roof had settled precariously on a twisted metal beam, its weight distributed just enough to prevent total collapse. But only just. Every shift of the debris caused the structure to groan, as if warning that its balance was temporary. Beneath it, the darkness held its breath. It was thick, stale, and hot, heavy with the scent of rust, dust, and oil. The silence wasn't true silence. It carried the thinnest thread of sound, so faint it bordered on imagined. It wasn't barking. It wasn't movement. It was breath, fragile, staggered, like lungs struggling to remember how to fill. David worked with care born of both instinct and necessity. Each piece of rubble he moved was catalogued in his mind, its weight, its direction, its pressure against the rest. He didn't speak, didn't hum. The only sounds were the scrape of concrete against metal, the low shifting sighs of the wreckage, and that breath, that uneven fractured breath. He knelt low, pressing his ear close to the crevices, isolating each direction. Every inch of progress had to be earned. It had been over 2 hours. The sun had begun to rise, bleeding soft pinks and oranges into the gray dust of morning. Light filtered through the cracks, catching on particles in the air and turning them into a golden haze. But inside the collapsed shell of the building, it was still night. His shoulders ached. His spine felt disconnected from his body. The air beneath the respirator was thick with humidity from his own breath, and the filter stung against the raw skin on his cheeks. He could have stopped. Others might have. But the breath hadn't stopped, and that meant neither could he. He widened a narrow path beneath the beam, enough to shine his flashlight deeper. At first, all he saw was rubble, cracked cement, rusted tools, the remains of a metal shelf twisted beyond recognition. Then something caught the light. A flicker, not movement, reflection. He leaned closer, adjusted the beam. Eyes. They didn't blink. They didn't flinch. Just 2 dull brown circles peering back at him through layers of ruin. They weren't wild, not afraid, just tired, profoundly tired, as if fear had long since burned itself out, leaving only the ashes of exhaustion behind. David froze. The rest of the body was almost invisible, buried beneath a shallow drift of concrete dust and shattered wallboard. Black fur coated in gray. A long leg, scraped raw along one side. A shoulder, barely rising with breath. And the ear, bent unnaturally, split at the tip, crusted with dried blood. The dog's chest moved, but just barely. A slow, shallow rise. Then a pause. Then again. It wasn't enough, but it was something. David dropped to his knees and began clearing space around the beam. He couldn't reach the dog yet. The concrete slab above was too low, too unstable. But he could get closer. He shifted brick by brick, creating a crawl space. He checked the structure with each motion, watching for sagging or tension. The building murmured above him but didn't fall. The dog didn't react. No growl, no whine, no blink. Just that slow rise and fall of the rib cage. David whispered to no one, barely aware of the words. They were more for the air than the animal. He inched forward, lowered himself flat on his stomach, and extended one arm. The gap was too narrow to touch. He pulled his arm back, took a small crowbar from his bag, and began levering aside the thicker debris with one hand while holding a flashlight in the other. Each movement was met with a tremor of the structure, but he continued. Minutes stretched. Dust clung to his skin. Blood from scraped knuckles mixed with the grime on his palms. Still, he worked. Not because he believed in some miracle, but because the breath was still there, because something was still choosing to live. Finally, he opened a space just wide enough to see the dog's full face. The muzzle was caked in dirt. One eye was half closed, swollen. The other never left him. That eye held no fight, no fear, just weight. Like everything it had carried had settled into the bones behind it, the kind of look that didn't plead or question, just waited. David reached again, slower this time. His fingers brushed the dog's fur, coarse, hot, trembling beneath the skin. The dog didn't pull away, didn't react at all, but David felt the life beneath the surface, weak, flickering, but there. That was enough. He pulled back slowly, sat up, wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a trembling hand. The sun had fully risen now. Light pooled over the broken edges of the building, touching the dog's coat through the dust. It made the black fur shimmer faintly, like charcoal kissed by flame. He didn't know how long the dog had been there. He didn't know how long it could hold on, but for now, breath still came, barely. And for now, that was everything. They pulled the dog out by nightfall. Not on a stretcher. There wasn't one. Just a sleeping bag, unzipped, and laid over a sheet of plywood. Dust clung to every strand of fur. The dog's body was too warm, not from life, but from something internal and slow-burning, like a fever trying to ignite what was barely alive. David didn't wait for instruction. He lifted one corner of the makeshift sled and guided it toward the row of tents set up by the volunteer crews. The air had cooled since morning, but his shirt stuck to his back with sweat. Around him, the world was full of motion, shouting, lights flickering across collapsed structures, generators humming. But it all felt far away, muffled by the weight of the body he pulled behind him. Inside the triage tent, there were crates of supplies, cots for medics, scattered tools and tangled cables, but no space for another emergency. The people there were busy, human injuries, collapsing lungs, crushed limbs. No one turned him away, but no one reached for the dog either, and so David stayed. He chose the farthest corner and lowered the sleeping bag carefully, gently, as if the weight might vanish if he moved too fast. The dog didn't respond. His body sank into the blanket like waterlogged cloth. Limbs extended awkwardly, one hind leg trembling in short, unconscious pulses. The chest rose, but only just. Each breath was shallow, uncertain, the kind taken when the body isn't sure it should keep trying. David knelt beside him and pulled a clean rag from his bag. He found a bottle of water, poured some into the corner of a metal bowl, and soaked the cloth. The first swipe across the dog's face left streaks of mud and blood on the towel. He cleaned around the eyes, the mouth, the cracked and scabbed nose. The dog didn't flinch. That worried him more than any twitch would have. He tore off a strip of gauze, dipped it, and let water fall gently onto the tongue. Then the gums. Just droplets. Enough to remind the body it still belonged to the world. He counted the breaths. 6 in a minute, then 4, then 5. Inconsistent. Dangerous. He checked the pads on the paws. Torn, swollen, embedded with debris. One claw bent sideways, black with dried blood. The ear was worse up close. Split through the cartilage, crusted with filth. The smell rising from the body wasn't rot, not yet, but it carried heat and desperation. The smell of something on the edge. David had no medical training beyond first aid, no tools beyond what could be scrounged from a relief bag. But he had hands, and time, and presence. He laid the cloth across the dog's shoulders and pressed down lightly, giving weight, giving contact. Not pressure, just proof that the world still included him. Hours passed. The tent filled and emptied again. Outside, a storm rolled across the far ridge. Distant thunder that never came close enough to break the stillness inside. He never left. He sat on the dirt floor, back against a crate of thermal blankets, eyes never far from the dog's face. At some point, he realized the blinking had stopped. The eyes were half open, still glossy, but unmoving now. He leaned closer, pressed 2 fingers lightly to the inside of the leg. No pulse, no movement. He shifted his hand to the ribs, waited. 1 breath, then another after too long. Barely there, but there. David exhaled slowly. He didn't speak, didn't think. He just placed his palm across the dog's side and held it there. Heat radiated beneath the fur, uneven and unstable. He thought about the moment he first heard the breath under the rubble, about the dust that had settled in the dog's eyes, about how stillness could feel like surrender. He didn't know the name, didn't know the story. All he knew was that life was still inside this broken shell, and for now, that life had someone beside it. He stayed like that for the rest of the night. No action left to take, no miracle to summon, just the rhythm of a chest rising a few millimeters at a time under the weight of a stranger's hand, still alive, for now. And for David, that was reason enough not to move. Morning brought wind, the kind that rustled the canvas walls of the tent and whispered through the half-zipped seams like breath from another world. The sky outside was washed in the pale gold of early daylight, but inside the tent, everything remained still. The dog hadn't moved, not during the night, not when the sun touched the edges of the blanket. His body remained curled, inert, as if he no longer belonged to the rhythm of passing hours. David woke to the sound of fabric flapping and the cold edge of morning air against his face. His back ached from sleeping on the ground, his legs stiff, but he barely noticed. His eyes went straight to the figure beside him. No change. But then he saw it. Barely a flicker, the slow twitch of a nose when he unwrapped a pouch of warm broth mixed with rice and shredded chicken. He didn't speak, just knelt quietly, letting the scent drift. A second twitch. The nostrils fluttered again. Not hunger, just recognition. David dipped a spoon into the mixture, held it close to the dog's muzzle. At first, nothing. Then, the faintest flick of the tongue. Hesitant, as if even that small act demanded too much trust. He stayed like that, spoon in hand, body leaning just far enough forward to keep the motion steady, patient. No pushing, no coaxing, just presence. Eventually, another flick of the tongue. A few drops of broth disappeared. Then, nothing. David didn't push for more. He placed the bowl nearby and sat back, eyes watching every breath. By midday, a team of volunteer veterinarians arrived from Cedar City. 2 women and a young man. They moved briskly, quietly, with hands trained in the language of trauma. David stepped aside, but didn't leave. He watched as they examined the dog with calm efficiency, pressing gently along his ribs, checking his eyes, palpating the joints. The verdict was clear. Severe dehydration, internal bruising, a broken front leg. Nothing surgical for now. But recovery was only possible with round-the-clock care. They offered to transport the dog to a shelter center nearby. There, he might get fluids, maybe a cage, maybe a quiet corner. But nothing promised. Too many animals, too few hands. David shook his head. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just said he'd stay. The vets didn't press him. They handed over a small kit, bandages, antiseptic, a syringe for subcutaneous fluids, and left. David folded the tent flap back and stood in the wind for a moment. Then he returned, knelt, and wrapped the dog's leg in padded gauze, slow and cautious, his fingers learning every ridge of bone beneath the swollen skin. That afternoon, he carried the dog in his arms out into the sun. Not too far, just beyond the tent where the shade fell in slanted patches near the broken fence line. He laid him down gently, propped him against a rolled-up towel to elevate the injury, then sat nearby. a bottle of water in one hand, the other resting lightly on the ground close enough to touch, but never touching without invitation. He spoke only once, low and quiet. A name, not quite a name. Buddy. Later, my guy. Then silence again. The dog didn't respond, but his eyes, clouded still, barely open, began to track. Not quickly, not with understanding, but with effort. They followed the hand that poured water. They flicked toward the shadows when David stood. And once, when he reached for the medical kit, those eyes stayed fixed on him until he returned. David noticed. He said nothing, just resumed his post beside the fragile breath and broken bones. Each small reaction was like the first crack of light under a heavy door. Hope not spoken, not even fully felt, just existing. Tentatively, like something rediscovered rather than born anew. That evening, when the wind died and the sky turned the color of rust, David brought the dog back inside. Not because it was time, but because the night would be cold. He laid him again on the blanket, adjusted the wrappings on the paw, and fed him a few more spoonfuls of broth. The dog didn't wag, didn't whine, but his eyes stayed on David a little longer before sleep pulled him under again, and that was enough. For now, the days no longer blurred into one another. There were markers now, small ones at first, nearly invisible unless you knew how to look. The rise and fall of breath no longer felt like a question. It carried weight, slow and steady, like a body remembering its own gravity. A week had passed. Then another. The air grew cooler in the evenings, the winds rougher, swirling through broken windows and under canvas flaps like a reminder that nothing stays still for long. The dog began to rise. Not often, and never easily. But he rose. 3 legs bore him where 4 had failed. The injured paw remained stiff, still wrapped in gauze, still tender when the cold touched it too quickly. But the other limbs learned to compensate, to carry. His first steps were hesitant, the second, bolder. By the 3rd evening of trying, he moved short distances without collapsing. He did not seek David out. He didn't follow in the loyal, eager way of dogs who know they are safe. Instead, he moved near, always near, not too close, not behind, beside, as though his body was learning to trust the space, not just the man within it. He no longer flinched at noise, when wind rattled loose sheet metal or sent clouds of dust across the ruins. He squinted, lowered his head, but stayed upright. No retreat, no return to the blanket. Each moment outside was claimed like a piece of ground he no longer feared. Food became routine. No coaxing, no spoon-fed offerings. He ate now with quiet urgency, like someone relearning what it meant to want something and believe they might receive it. The tremble in his limbs remained. The tension in his gaze had not disappeared, but his breathing, steady, even, present, spoke of a body no longer bracing against the world. Each evening, as the sky dimmed and the heat withdrew into the earth, the dog lay just outside the tent flap. Not curled inward like before, not facing the warmth or the man who had pulled him from the wreckage. He faced outward, nose pointed toward the open plain, ears flicking now and then to track the last bird calls. He did not guard the camp. He simply watched, as though making sure the world did not close around him again. He made no sound, no bark, no whimper, only breath. But it was a breath that filled space. That belonged to something with mass again, with presence, with a name, even if unspoken. One afternoon, David sat by the riverbed, a stretch of dry rock and low water that wound through the remains of what once had been a picnic area. The wind was high that day, and the sky carried the color of old steel. David picked up a stick, held it for a moment, then tossed it toward the reeds without looking behind him. The dog froze. His whole body tensed, eyes locked on the movement. He did not move right away. He didn't wag his tail. But after a long pause, measured in heartbeats, not seconds, he limped forward. Not fast, not with joy, but with intent. He reached the stick, sniffed it, then, clumsily, picked it up in his mouth and turned back. He dropped it halfway, as if testing whether the gesture was enough. David didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. The dog returned, picked up the stick again, carried it all the way this time and set it down with careful precision at David's side. It wasn't play. It wasn't memory. It was statement. I am here. I remember how. The moment passed without celebration. No words, no laughter, just the soft rush of river water and the quiet rhythm of breath shared between them. That night the dog curled near the fire pit, his body not touching David's, but angled toward him, eyes half closed, ears relaxed. For the first time since they met, he slept before David did. And in the silence between breaths and footsteps, between spoonfuls of rice and stick retrieved from the dirt, something unspoken had been shaped. A kind of voice, not made of bark or sound, but of trust. Their voice, born between the rubble, and growing heavier with each day it chose to stay. A month had passed since the earth shook. The streets of Beacon Ridge still bore the fractures. Dust clung to walls like old grief, and people packed what little they had into trucks with more silence than ceremony. Some left with determination, others with numb resignation. The town wasn't dead, but it no longer breathed the way it once had. David moved through the remains of his volunteer station, folding tarps, labeling supplies, loading boxes into the back of his old SUV. The work was methodical, almost meditative. His hands knew what to do. His thoughts lingered elsewhere. The dog, now officially named Bruno on a new collar and in the paperwork signed the week prior, lay in the grass nearby. He didn't watch David like a guard or shadow. He simply rested, the kind of rest that had taken weeks to earn. His body, once tense with every sound, now stretched into the warmth like he belonged in it. He wasn't leashed. He didn't need to be. There was no urgency in his posture, no flicker of fear at the creak of boxes or the closing of car doors. He watched, occasionally lifting his head, ears twitching at the murmur of a passing breeze, but always settling again. When David opened the passenger door and tapped the seat lightly, Bruno didn't leap. He didn't rush. He stood slowly, stretched, shook the dust from his coat, and walked over. He paused at the threshold of the vehicle, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement. Then he climbed in, not as a passenger, not as cargo, as if stepping into a space that already knew the shape of him. The drive north was long, the kind of distance that felt wider because of where they had come from, not just the miles. Their destination was Idaho, to David's brother's place, a stretch of land on the outskirts of Boise, where a weathered porch overlooked a small creek, and a crooked maple tree stood like an old sentry beside the bedroom window. David hadn't been there in years, but now it felt like a place worth returning to. Bruno didn't curl up in the back seat. He sat, upright at first, gazing out the window. His eyes moved across the passing world like a reader scanning a page. Mountains softened into foothills. Burned grasslands gave way to green. Time passed not in hours, but in the slow release of tension from muscles long held taut. David didn't speak. He adjusted the mirror once to check on Bruno. The dog was still watching, not alert, not restless, just present. 3 hours in, the rhythm of the road and the hush of tires on asphalt began to cradle the cab in quiet. Bruno shifted. He turned once, twice, and then, without ceremony, lowered himself into the seat. His head rested against the inside of the door, eyes closed. Not from exhaustion, from peace. It wasn't sleep. Not at first. It was permission. The silent kind that comes not from being told everything will be all right, but from knowing someone stayed, from the feeling that the worst had already been met and survived. David reached over once and let his hand rest near Bruno's paw, not touching, just near. A quiet offering. The dog didn't stir. When they pulled into the gravel drive just past dusk, The porch light was already on. Moths hovered around its glow. The maple's silhouette stretched across the siding like a memory reaching out. Bruno jumped out when the door opened. He didn't bolt. He didn't sniff nervously. He stood still for a long moment, nose lifted to the new air, as though testing whether this place, too, would hold. He followed David up the steps, not in step, but in sync. Later, when the boxes were unpacked and the lights dimmed, David sat on the porch. Bruno lay beside him, not against his leg, but close enough that their warmth overlapped. No commands had been given, no promises made. But something unspoken had rooted itself between them. Not a rescue, not a debt, just presence. The kind that says, "I found you, and I stayed." The cabin didn't feel like a finish line. It felt like a beginning. Not loud, not clean, but real. A home not built with blueprints or contracts. A home that lived under the skin. And in that stillness, with the night humming low and the stars blinking awake overhead, Bruno exhaled. Slow, certain. He had stopped searching. Not because the world made sense, but because he'd found someone who didn't look away. And in a world full of breaking, that was enough.